Good evening, and thank you for joining Senator Murkowski and Senator Sullivan's virtual town hall. My name is Mike Anderson, and I'll be tonight's moderator. In just a few moments, I'll turn it over to the senators for some very brief opening remarks to kick off this evening's town hall. But before I do, I'd like to take a few moments to let everyone know that if you'd like to ask a question tonight, please press *3 at any time, and you'll be connected with a call operator. Again, if you'd like the opportunity to ask a question tonight, please press *3 to enter the queue. With that, we'll turn the call over to Senator Murkowski.
Well, thanks, Mike, and I'm going to try to be good to your word about very brief remarks so that we can try to get in as many questions from Alaskans tonight as we can. I'm pleased to be able to be on the line again with Senator Sullivan as we field inquiries from folks around the state. Just a very, very brief recap on what's been going on here in Washington, D.C. I had sincerely hoped that this would be a week where not only Alaskans, but the country would be able to see considered and thoughtful debate about the issues around race and the concerns that we have seen with regards to police practices that I think we would say some of what we have seen in the news, in the media, has just been sickening and sad. The tragic death of George Floyd, all that brings with it, has been a reminder that while we have extraordinary law enforcement that serves to stand and protect, that you do have instances where we see practices that are not acceptable. And so the conversation about police reform is one that I think was important, is necessary, but unfortunately we have stalled out in the United States Senate. I don't think that this has been our best week, in fairness. There was legislation that was brought to the Senate floor that was introduced. It's actually the only bill on police reform that has been filed in the Senate, the Justice Act. It contained, I felt, some substantive, some practical solutions focused on accountability and transparency. There were many similarities, common ground between this Senate bill and what was filed in the House. But I think we saw that politics got in the way. We were not even able to bring the bill to the open floor of the Senate for discussion and an amendment. And that, I think, was not it's not a good mark on the Senate. I don't think it's good for the country, because I think these matters, as difficult as they are, deserve to be debated. They deserve to have an open forum for the American public to see and ultimately to come together to reach some resolution. But we were not able to accomplish that. I do believe that it will be back in front of us, and I look forward to that opportunity for good debate, for good amendment, and improvement on base bills. Moving to a subject of discussion that we are all engaged in throughout the state as we deal with COVID-19 and the impact, not only from a health perspective, but from an economic perspective. We have been pushing for some period of time, the Alaska delegation, Senator Sullivan, Congressman Young, myself, trying to get the Treasury Department and the SBA to recognize that as much good as came with the Paycheck Protection Program, it failed to accommodate our commercial fishing businesses in being able to account for crew member payroll when they applied for the PPP. But we have just received the final word from Treasury that our fishermen will have the same opportunity to fully take advantage of the PPP that so many American businesses have benefited from. So that was good news received just today. I know Senator Sullivan and I will be talking about this more throughout the hour, but one very serious takeaway is that the deadline to participate in the PPP at the end of this month, so it's coming up fast. We've done well as a state with the PPP. Alaska, at last count, had received 10,523 loans totaling over $1.2 billion. Again, I mentioned that the deadline to apply for these loans is next Tuesday, June 30th. Very quickly, and then I will close my remarks. Last week, the Senate passed the Great American Outdoors Act. This was a compilation of two pieces of legislation that we moved out of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which I chair, but it is focused on deferred maintenance backlogs at Alaska's national parks, forests, refuges, as well as our public lands around the country. But it's significant for us because we know that we have some longer-term deferred maintenance issues, whether it's the Denali Park Road or others that will be able to see some help. The bill also provides more money for the stateside LWCF, Land Water Conservation Fund, that helps with state projects, whether it's a ball field in Utqiagvik or a playground in Anchorage, ski area in Cordova. So we see the impact to our state. So that has now moved over to the House side, and hopefully we'll see further action on that significant land and conservation bill. Last thing, and I will leave this to my colleague, Senator Sullivan, to speak more in detail on. We are taking up the annual defense bill, the National Defense Authorization, the NDAA, which is critical funding for our troops, equipping our military with the resources that they need. We've got a provision in there for an Arctic Security Center, but Senator Sullivan has been leading on these issues with his position on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I know he has more to share with Alaskans on the many things that he's been able to include within this very, very important bill. We've got a great team effort working there with him on the authorizing committee with the Senate Armed Services and what I'm able to do on defense appropriations. But with his leadership, we're going to see some good benefits and enhancements for our military in Alaska and around the country. With that, I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dan Sullivan.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and good evening, everybody, and thanks again for joining us. This is our 11th Teletown Hall, and I can tell you we, as your delegation, get so much out of this. We appreciate you taking the time to ask questions, to give us your comments and your concerns and ideas. And I think that's really important because part of the update that I'm going to provide are literally ideas that we've gotten from these kind of teletown halls or other outreach events that we've done, and then we've tried to implement them in the execution primarily of the CARES Act. So thanks again. I know that everybody's busy, and we really appreciate your participation. Senator Murkowski talked about the PPP and where it's kind of evolved from when we initially passed the Paycheck Protection Program. And again, from hearing from a number of you, last week I mentioned that we had changed it legislatively in a way that I think most Alaskans wanted to expand the loan forgiveness period from 8 weeks to 6 months, to extend the term of the loan itself from 2 years to 5 years, and then to reorder the amount of the loan you have to use towards payroll from 75% to 60%. These are all things that we heard from all of you. We were able to get that done in legislation. And then, as Lisa mentioned, and it's a little late, but better late than never, because we've been pounding SBA and Treasury to fix this for about 2 months. But we did get, finally today, just published by the Treasury Department, for our commercial fishermen who are the ultimate small businesses. They have not been able really to utilize the PPP much because they've not been able to include their crew and deckhands as part of their employees for rather arcane tax reasons. That now, as of tonight, has changed. So we want to encourage everybody. We've been making calls before this call. If you haven't, and you have a fishing boat with a crew, you can now apply for a PPP and have a much larger loan because you can count your crew as your employees. And what I want to mention, this was an example of really good collaboration that we had on one of these town halls. With this issue, I had reached out to some of our friends in Kodiak, the Kodiak Economic Task Force. They raised this. They even helped write kind of the language of how you would fix it. Julie Bonney, Duncan Fields, a bunch of others. So I just want to thank them, but that's exactly the kind of outreach that we are getting feedback on, and then are able to go try to implement that. As Senator Murkowski said, we only have until June 30th to apply, so it's not a lot of time. There's still plenty of money in the PPP appropriation program, and as she also mentioned, some of our earlier town halls, the frustration with this program was very apparent, but some of it is now finally starting to work. The EIDL loans, we've had over 5,000 now in our state, valued at over $300 million. The EIDL grants, almost 8,500, valued at $28 million. So if you remember from some of our first Teletown Halls, we had single digits in those areas. So I think that's progress, but we know that people are still really challenged through these very difficult times, both from a health perspective and a real challenge on the economic side, and we're hopeful that this is the kind of relief that's going to get us through these challenging times. Senator Murkowski mentioned the NDAA, that's the National Defense Authorization Act. We marked that up out of the Armed Services Committee, on which I sit, 2 weeks ago, and we started debating it on the floor of the Senate today. And this is a really important bill, funds our military, pay raises for our troops, but for our state, it's been particularly important in the last 4 years through the authorizations in this bill and the appropriations that Senator Murkowski mentioned in the Appropriations Committee. We've had about $1.4 billion in military construction for our state, given our strategic location, given our missile defense, given the importance of the Coast Guard. This NDAA will add about another $200 million to that for military construction in the state. In addition, as Senator Murkowski mentioned, and the Ted Stevens Department of Defense Arctic Security Studies Center. It's got a number of other things that we think will benefit Alaska, and it even has provisions that I was focused on to make sure our recruiters, military recruiters, get out to our rural communities. Particularly, we have more veterans per capita than any state in the country. We have very patriotic members of the military and veterans in our great state, and this is encouraging recruiters to make sure, hey, even if you live out in a remote village off the grid, the recruiters should go out there, because these are some of our most patriotic communities, and we want to make sure everybody has the opportunity to serve. And so that's one of the elements in there that I'm proud of. I just want to talk about a couple other quick points, and then we want to take your questions. This doesn't make a lot of news, but I actually think it's very important. We confirmed our 200th federal judge to the federal bench this week. And for the first time in 40 years, there are actually no vacancies on any of the federal courts of appeals. This is particularly important for our state, I believe, because I interview almost all of these circuit court judges, as they're called, all the ones on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. And what I think is impressive is that they recognize it's their job to interpret the written law, the written Constitution, and not to make policy. That's been a problem, to be perfectly blunt, with some of the judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in a way that has not always worked out well for our state. And I believe having a lot of these new judges on the Ninth Circuit is going to be very important for Alaska in the long run, and that was quite a milestone this week of 200 Federal Court of Appeals judges that we've confirmed in the last 3.5 years. Senator Murkowski already talked about the Justice Act. She and I were both co-sponsors of that legislation, led by our colleague, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. It was a serious bill, and I, like Senator Murkowski, was disappointed that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle did not even want to debate it. There was a number of things in there that were quite important for policing, for funding of police, for de-escalation training, for transparency, for tactics like chokeholds and body cameras. I had the opportunity to have a roundtable with our police chiefs throughout the state today. And one of the things that all of you know, I'm sure, is that the vast, vast, vast majority of our police in Alaska are honorable. They put their lives on the line for us every single day. And when I was reviewing this legislation with them, it was good to hear from them that many of these best practices that the federal government is trying to incentivize and implement in the wake of the horrendous George Floyd murder are already being utilized by most of our police forces in Alaska. And I think that that's a good message. I told the chiefs that I would mention that on the Teletown Hall tonight, because I think it's important for us to know that and to see that what we're trying to get done at the federal level, in the Senate and the Congress, in many ways is already happening in our state. And I think that's an important issue to get out. Finally, I do just want to say one final thing. I mentioned our veterans. Today, June 25th, is the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War, called the Forgotten War by some. I've never liked that term because there's so many brave Americans, Alaskans who served in that war, brutal war. We have a wonderful Korean American community in our state that has veterans from the Korean War. And I think as a state, it's just important to remember that sacrifice. We have a number of Korean War veterans, and so that's a milestone that I think it's important for all of us to remember. So thanks again. Look forward to your questions. Appreciate everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. We will get through this challenging time stronger and more resilient than ever.
All right, thank you, Senator Sullivan. Once again, for any listeners looking to ask a question tonight, please press *3 to be placed into the queue. And with that, we're going to go to Christy Land, who's got a question for the Senator. Looks like we lost her. We're going to go to Susan and Gustavus, who's got a question.
Thank you. Good evening, Senators. Thank you for making this opportunity for asking questions. I want to ask about the progress of Senate Bill 3608, Coronavirus Relief Fund Flexibility for State and Local Government Act, that you introduced, and Senator John Kennedy appropriated for a much broader possibility than aiding municipalities in being able to use the CARES Act fund. Can you tell me any progress update on Senate Bill 3608? Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Susan. It's Dan. I'll give you a quick update on that. We had the Secretary of the Treasury come to our policy lunch on Tuesday, and the discussion at that lunch was a lot about what we were looking at, possibly another additional legislation that we would be working on probably in the July timeframe. There was a number of ideas that we discussed, and one of them was definitely this legislation. And as you probably know, Senator Kennedy and I have been trying to move this for some time. It's getting more and more bipartisan. We have a number of co-sponsors. Now it's over 10, I believe. And I think most of the governors in America, whether Democrats or Republicans, are also very supportive of the bill. I know you know, but just for everybody else's benefit, what the bill would do is it would make clear that for the money that's already been appropriated, the money that's already out the door to all the states, the $1.3 billion that, for example, our state received from the CARES Act, that when that is sent to boroughs and municipalities and sub-components, political components of the state, that these cities or municipalities or boroughs could use that money in a more flexible way, including, and importantly, lost revenues that are the direct result of the pandemic. And I think this makes sense. I think it's what the CARES Act originally was meant to do. Senator Kennedy and I and a couple other senators went to meet with the President and Secretary Mnuchin about this about 4 weeks ago. And Secretary Mnuchin raised this as an issue that they thought was going to be important, and so did we, in what we would be viewing as the next phase of legislation. So it's still very much on everybody's minds. It's still very much on the senior administration officials' minds. And like I said, the bill right now in the Senate has a very broad cross-section of Democrats and Republicans who are for it. I think it would significantly help our state. So we're going to keep pushing it, but the fact that the Secretary of the Treasury raised it in a meeting with us just a couple days ago, I think is a good sign that the administration is still quite interested in it as well.
And let me add to what Dan has said there, because he's keyed in on the ask. The ask is flexibility with the monies that have already been authorized and appropriated. So this is not an ask for the next round of funding. This is give us flexibility to respond to the need on the ground. And you said you were from Gustavus. Well, okay, Gustavus is a community that is pretty quiet in the winter months, and in the summer months it comes alive with the tourists that are coming in to Glacier Bay. But we know what is happening in Gustavus and in so many parts of the state this year when we are not seeing the tourists come in. The cruise ships are down, travel is down, and thus our tourism-based economy is really taking a significant hit. A community like Gustavus, small population, you don't have the ability to go out and generate additional tax revenue to pay for the needs of the community there. You rely on what comes in from that tourist base. So is this loss of income, this loss of revenue to your community, directly attributable to COVID? Yes, because COVID has shut off that opportunity for again that tourist base that sustains you during these summer months. So this is about flexibility. It is a priority for many, many. Where we're getting caught up and tangled is you do have some cities, some major cities that have, let's just say, they've been living beyond their means, if you will, and so there is considerable pushback from those who will say, we don't want to be bailing out cities who have not been just budgeting responsibly, and so this should not be a bailout for cities. I would agree with that, but again, I would ask people to look at the situation, whether it's a community like you have in Gustavus, or whether it is the Denali Borough up outside of Denali National Park. It gets over 80% of their revenues from a bed tax, and they're just not seeing those revenues this year. So through no fault of your own, you have been impacted this way. The CARES Act funding was designed to help supplement and support the impact that we have seen from COVID. We need this flexibility to do it. So the effort that we have all been engaged in from day one, really, on this is worth fighting for. I feel pretty optimistic that in this next iteration, whether we call it CARES or whatever we're calling it, that there will be additional flexibility to the states.
Thank you, Senator. Next up, we're going to go to Elena in Eagle River.
I have basically two questions on the PPP loan forgiveness. Do you know when the revised application for forgiveness is going to be completed with the 24-week? When they made that change, they pulled the other application and banks aren't accepting it. And then also when I talked to our bank, they said that the SBA has not got the portal open on their website, so they can't accept any applications until they can submit it into the SBA.
You know, I don't know the timing on that. We can work to find out. And Dan, maybe you have more information on this, but I know that this was something that it was important to try to get this forgiveness application more streamlined, just more rational, because it had started off, the application for forgiveness was what, like 11 pages, which was not where we needed it to be. But I don't know the date on that. So I'll kick that over to you, Dan, if you have anything more.
Yeah, Elena, this was another topic, a discussion that we had with the Secretary of the Treasury. And again, what we were pressing him on in this meeting that a number of us had with him just a couple days ago was to do what Lisa was just mentioning, make sure this is streamlined and not some kind of giant 11-page, but 1 to 2 pages. And they're even looking at, and I don't want to jinx it here because it might not happen, but they're even looking at almost like the idea for really small businesses, if their loan wasn't that big, that there might be a safe harbor provision that just allows forgiveness under a certain amount. The point of that, and a number of senators were pressing the Secretary on that, is that if you're a small business and your loan is not a very large loan, the amount of time and effort and work that you'd have to pay just to put into filling this out starts to overtake the purpose of the loan. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but my understanding is that the 11-page loan forgiveness application has been simplified down to about 5 pages, but it has not yet been released. And what we can do is reach out to Treasury and SBA and get a estimated time on when they plan on doing it. but I know they're very focused on it because the Secretary of the Treasury was talking about it, and a number of the senators were giving him our views on how to keep it simple.
All right, thank you, Senators. Next up, we're going to go to Steve in Fairbanks.
Oh, thank you, Senators. I appreciate you doing these meetings. I assume you can hear me all right.
Yep, can hear you good, Steve.
Okay, yeah, I know you guys have been working hard on the hospital funding that we're needing, and I know there's a lot of frustration with the Secretary and trying to have him understand why we are not fitting in the boxes very well and why we're slipping through the crack. And to me, one of our big issues with that first tranche was it became apparent that we were not a high volume hospital, and I keep focused on that because I think that we would have gotten about $30 million if we'd have just gotten a pro rata share based on per capita, but we only got $5.6 million, I think. So I was just wondering if you have any updates. I know your staff's working on things and stuff. I just want to know if you have any update for us. And I know you guys have been working hard on it. I'm just wondering about it.
Well, Steve, you kind of faded out there towards the end, but what you have raised with the situation at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, as you know, has been probably the biggest source of frustration that we have had with the CARES Act funding that has gone out to hospitals and providers. Our other facilities around the state, the distribution has been such that, well, it's not everything that everyone is asking for. It's there to help, and yet Fairbanks has been with every one of these formulas. It's kind of like you just one off, and even with this latest round, we have not seen the help to Fairbanks, and you're kind of in this. Almost a purgatory type of a situation because you're not big enough for certain categories and you're too big for others. The fact that you are a rural soul community hospital should put you again in a different category, but the fact that you are close enough to another larger category is yet again part of the problem. We understand there's about $75 billion that is left in the various pots of money at the federal level to be ultimately distributed. And again, what we've been working to do with the folks at HHS has been to make sure that we can get this money to Alaska, and most specifically to the needs in Fairbanks there. I introduced a bill just a little bit ago to make sure that hospitals like Fairbanks Memorial would be included in the future payments. I think this is something that, again, Senator Sullivan has led a couple calls to the Deputy Secretary, and he will respond to this after me, but we have been very, I think, persistent and probably aggressive is a good word as well, trying to explain the very, very unique situation, the very unique status that you have there in Fairbanks in terms of who you serve and how you serve as this community hospital. It is unique, and it's almost that uniqueness that has put you in a situation where these formula formula provisions are not working. So I wish that I could tell you that we had great news tonight to announce about what is coming and when it's coming. I don't have that, but what I will commit to you, as I know Dan and Don will, is that we are continuing to very aggressively push the department on this because Fairbanks not receiving near anything that they should have received based on formula fundings for other hospitals is not right. So we're continuing to press aggressively.
Yeah, Steve, not much to add to what Lisa mentioned. Just be assured that, you know, the Deputy Secretary, the Secretary of HHS, the Deputy Secretary, the whole apparatus there knows everything there is to know about Fairbanks Memorial Hospital. I actually have a call with the Deputy Secretary again on Monday about this topic. So we are continuing to press. I was in Fairbanks last weekend and again heard about it. And, you know, what we're trying to do is get them to recognize some kind of dual designation for sole community hospital and rural referral center, not the urban designation that they had originally classified Fairbanks as. So we are pressing it because, as Lisa mentioned and as you mentioned, and I saw a number of folks affiliated with the hospital last weekend, this kind of fallen in the cracks of these different national formulas is unacceptable, particularly given how important that hospital is to such a large part of our state. So we're on it. We're pressing it. Like Senator Murkowski, I wish I had a little bit better news, but we are certainly not done pressing the leadership team at HHS, and you know, if we need to, we'll go over to the White House here soon and just get this finalized. So we'll keep working it.
Thank you, Senators. Next up, we're going to go to Sunny in Anchorage.
Hi, this is Sunny Mall. I wanted to start a little bit with my background. I'll try to be brief. I was born in Palmer, raised in Chugiak. At 19, I bought a home in Mountain View. I'm a 28-year resident of Mountain View. I'm a 25-year educator, 3 years in the Peace Corps, 10 years at Bartlett High, or a little less than 10 years at Bartlett High School. I've trained teachers at UAA, and now I split my time between Homer and the Anchorage Bowl. And my specific concern has to do with the founders of Black Lives Matter. I want to know what, if anything, our leaders thought about the strategic posting to defund the police initiative that was posted on May 30th, 2020. What were your initial thoughts about that posting, and what are you doing specifically to engage residents of these communities in not only addressing what police are doing correctly, but what they can improve on? And then a follow-up question is, what specifically is Congress doing, if anything, to fix the destruction of the nuclear family in our most at-risk communities?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. Very thoughtful question. I do not believe that the answer is to defund our police. I think we recognize that we need law enforcement to keep our communities safe, and I recognize that that we do have some frustration with law enforcement, but I would ask people to just take a pause and think about the role that our law enforcement is playing nowadays. And Sunny, you mentioned that you're a long-term resident there in Mountain View. Mountain View is one of those neighborhoods that gets a lot of police call-outs, and some are for property crimes or crimes to persons, but some are calls because you have issues related to substance abuse, related to addiction. Some are calls that are reporting instances or issues with homeless individuals. Some are calls where a person is having a mental health episode or issues. Our police nowadays, and not just in Anchorage, but all over the country, are having to be that resource for so much of the need that we are seeing in our communities. I had an opportunity last Friday to visit one-on-one with our chief and deputy chief there in Anchorage, as well as the chief of police in Juneau and the chief of police in Fairbanks, and just kind of talking to them about what they view as the concerns from a federal response, what would be helpful. But every one of them took it back to the challenges that as a police force they have with these issues related to mental health, homelessness, and substance and addiction issues. Not those areas that you think of when it comes to policing and keeping streets safe and property crimes at bay. And so we had discussion about not a defunding of the police, but ensuring that those who provide for these services in our communities, whether it is Anchorage, Fairbanks, Juneau, or any place in between, that those services are there, that we have the treatment facilities in our communities, that we have the mental health support that we need in our communities, that we have the ability to better address the issues of homelessness. And they indicated to me that we have seen over the years in our state an erosion of some of these services, this social safety net, if you will. And when those erode, and we in the public, in our neighborhood, we are looking to have them addressed. If you don't have the mental health resources there, if you don't have the community services there, who do you turn to? You turn to the police. And so it struck me that these are the types of conversations that we need to be having in our local communities as we talk about policing and police reforms, but also recognizing that much of what we are asking of our law enforcement community is to intervene in areas that they were not trained to do. So do we need to look to devote further resources to mental health and other services in our communities? I think these are the types of conversations that are so important to the broader discussion. I've taken a fair amount of time in responding to that, so I'm going to turn to Dan. I know that there was a second part to your question, Sunny, but I'm going to defer to Dan on that one.
So, Sunny, let me thank you. It sounds like you are, for your students, are quite an exemplary teacher given your background and your passion. And I want to thank you and all our teachers. You know, I've spoken out on the Senate floor on a lot of these topics recently, but one thing I said unequivocally is I fully oppose the idea of defunding the police. As a matter of fact, in our state, there's no doubt that we need more funds for law enforcement, and one of the things Senator Murkowski and I did last summer was bring up Attorney General Barr, and you may have seen it was a lot was focused on our law enforcement challenges, particularly in rural Alaska, and he came away very, I think, moved and motivated by the need, and since that time, the Department of Justice has sent very significant funds, the U.S. Department of Justice, to helping address some of the law enforcement shortfalls with federal funds. So I think defunding the police is going the exact wrong way, and I've stated that on the Senate floor. I think the outreach is critical to all groups. I had a good discussion just last week in Fairbanks with the head of the NAACP about the Justice Act that we were talking about earlier, and then a very good roundtable with a number of our police chiefs just today. And as I mentioned, a lot of things they're doing are things that we had put in this bill. There's always room to improve, but I think that, as I mentioned, the vast majority of our law enforcement officers, I think, are honorable and do a good job in a hard situation, a very good job. But I think the question that you're getting at, which is one that's a really hard one and maybe one of the most important ones that doesn't always get talked about, is the government can't do everything, whether it's the police or teachers like yourself. And one of the things that I always say, particularly as it relates to our teachers, if you don't have engaged parents, then it makes it really hard to have the person that you're trying to teach get a good education. It can't all just be on the shoulders of our teachers. And that's, I think, the same thing with police and others. The more we have engaged parents, engaged families, and the issue of the nuclear family is obviously a very important one. There's stressors on that, but I think most of the studies show that if you were raised in that kind of environment, regardless of race, an environment with both parents there, the likelihood of being able to achieve educational and career success and move out of economically disadvantageous situations is much, much greater. So one of the things that I've looked at and have even co-sponsored are programs that help relieve the stressors on the nuclear family. As you're talking about, child care programs, addiction services, and I think that that's one of the keys that we have to look at. But again, engaged parents and families are in many ways the overlooked critical element of success, whether it's in school or in communities, and I think you're raising a really good point on this.
Thank you, Senators. Next, we're going to go to Walter Makestad.
Yes, hello, Senator Sullivan and Murkowski. Thank you for the opportunity. My question has to do with essential air service to rural communities. Our community is at about the exact geographic center of the state, and it's part of the Iditarod Area School District. It was once we were one of 10 sites. Now it's been reduced because of a number of factors to about 7. But I don't have to tell you that communities such as ours and our neighbors to the southwest, McGrath, Nikolai, Skodna, we're dependent very much upon support for aircraft only delivering passenger service, freight, and certainly mail. And I just would remind you historically that the first aviation flight was from Fairbanks to McGrath, and the point being that I understand in the McGrath area, essential air service contracts have been kind of upended with the absence now of Raven Air and then Penn Air as well, and they're struggling. And we have the benefit, though we used to receive our mail service through Anchorage. We had a 99623 zip code. Now it's a 99757. And I'm just curious why, with all the considerations of being cost effective for services, why we don't utilize the infrastructure to Fairbanks that we already have and provide mail to these communities I mentioned, Nikolai specifically, Takatna, and McGrath, through Fairbanks, because it would make a lot more sense than crossing the Alaska Range. So that's something that I would hope would be followed up, or I don't know how to go ahead with it, but I would ask you if any sort of comparative studies for better, more cost-effective logistics are explored. That's a primary one.
So, Walter, maybe I can just take a crack at that, and I think it's a really important question and a good question. We have been big supporters, as you can imagine, of Essential Air Service, the bypass mail program, all of these. Sometimes they are under attack by some of our colleagues, and we have to explain, when you don't have a lot of roads, these programs are essential. I actually just had a long phone call just a couple days ago with the FAA administrator on a number of issues relating to air service in Alaska, including safety. You may have seen the NTSB put out a report about 7 months ago on our high fatality rates, and one of the things that I was trying to get the FAA administrator's commitment on was a strategic plan based on the NTSB recent report on Alaska to really, really focus on bringing these high fatality rates, crash rates in our state down. But more directly to your question, you may have seen there was a bankruptcy court hearing today with regard to Raven that would help determine whether the carrier can come out of bankruptcy or to what degree it would, and what parts of the airline would. There are many interested bidders there. And as you know, the essential air service routes are put out by air carriers and selected through the Department of Transportation. It's a rather lengthy review process, but you're raising a really important issue. And having an ESA route go through Fairbanks rather than Anchorage would need additional Department of Transportation analysis. You noted the studies, and also importantly, interested carriers. But I think there are opportunities here. Obviously, the Raven bankruptcy has been very disruptive. But as you know, when those kind of things happen, people do look at these other potential routes. Current contracts, as it relates to ESA, would have to run their course, but I do think there's an opportunity here on that issue in particular, as the reorganization of some of our airlines post-pandemic, post-Raven bankruptcy is something that we certainly will be keeping an eye on. I focus a lot on our airline services as a member of the Commerce Committee, and you're raising an important point that we can keep an eye on.
Well, and I'll just be really brief on this, Walter. I agree with Senator Sullivan in saying that that with this disruption that we have seen with Raven, it may provide an opportunity. One of the reasons that we have, I guess, historically seen, or at least most recently seen, the services out of Anchorage is just a cost factor. It's cheaper to have the services consolidated there and ship out rather than breaking down mail in Anchorage and replacing the pallets to Fairbanks and then breaking them down again. But I do think that it is something that, given the situation in the state and the great deal of flux that we are seeing, it is probably an opportune time to actually look at this critically. Now, having said all this, I would certainly reaffirm what Dan has said about, you've got a very, very strong delegation in supporting essential air service, in supporting bypass mail, but we're also very, very strong in our commitment in saying we have to protect the Postal Service writ large, because it is under considerable stress. I think we all know that, and I think we recognize that as a state as large and remote, and the fact that most of our communities are not accessible by road, we rely on our Postal Service perhaps to a greater degree than most people in other states out there. And so whether we're talking essential air, bypass, it is all reliant on our ability to have a Postal Service that continues. So where we continue to work on it, your point that you have raised is one that I think is certainly worthy of further consideration as again we kind of sort through all that this bankruptcy filing by Raven means for the industry around the state. So thank you for that.
All right, next up we're going to go to Mike Bridges. He's got a question for the senators.
Good afternoon, Team Alaska. You guys both know me from previous life doing statewide emergency management and response. Now I'm doing the same thing in the private sector. My question is oriented on the national, I'll call it the national stockpile of PPE for emergencies such as pandemics and stuff, and the challenges we had and where we're at now, and taking China out of that future provider chain, which is still a major issue. And are we restocking our national stockpiles on that for future events, please? Especially PPE for health providers and mass populations that might be affected.
Yeah, Mike, I'll go ahead, Lisa. Sorry.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say we had a hearing in the Health Committee on Tuesday, focused on kind of lessons learned from where we are. Obviously we're still in the midst of the pandemic, so it's not like we're saying it's over and we're preparing. But you need to be paying attention to the lessons learned that are happening right now. And one of the things that we learned very early, very clearly, is that we didn't have sufficient stockpiles. And given your previous experience and as you say, what you're doing now, having a stockpile that is meaningful, and when I say meaningful, I mean something that can be responsive to need. And granted, we were hit quickly with COVID. It to a size and extent that certainly could not have been predicted. But we do this as a nation. We plan for this as a nation, and yet I think we realized that we had not planned accordingly. One of the things that became very, 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 very clear was that we've been outsourcing all of this. We've been saying it's just easier to get this all from China. Well, sure, it's really easy to get it all from China as long as there's nobody else asking for it. As long as you don't feel some level of vulnerability, I think we're all feeling more than a little bit vulnerable in having to rely on China for so much of the PPE, and really relying on any other country for it. Because when the need is there and we're not able to source it ourselves, I think this was a real wake-up call for us. It was certainly one of the key takeaways from our hearing about what we need to do to better prepare and have a stockpile that is our stockpile, a national stockpile, as opposed to relying on others for what we know to be critical resources.
So, Mike, I would just add that the CARES Act did include $16 billion to replenish our strategic national stockpiles, and so that's ongoing. As Lisa mentioned, there's no doubt that we were caught, I think, unprepared, not just with regard to stockpiles, but as she mentioned, supply lines that and supply chains that made us very vulnerable. So I think we're definitely taking action on both. The Vice President was at a lunch with us just yesterday, and he mentioned that possibly by the end of the summer we'll be close to, I think the number was, and I can get it for you, 50,000 ventilators in the stockpile. And I got to double check that number, but it was a big number. I wrote it down in my notes, but so we're making progress on that. You see companies like GM and others are actually making those. And you know, our state really stood up, which was great and showed our resiliency in terms of manufacturing gowns and face shields and even swabs, which I think it was tremendous to see that coming directly just from Alaska. But the final one that I think is going to be really important, an opportunity, there's already legislation, it's quite bipartisan by the way, to look at reinforcing our own supply chains, particularly on things like PPE and pharmaceuticals. And then one that Senator Murkowski and I have been working on for the last couple of years and weren't able to move it. This year in the NDAA, the bill called the Strategic Critical Minerals. So many of our strategic critical minerals that go into critical military hardware, solar panels, wind turbines, all of these, most of these are produced in China. And yet we actually have them in our own country, even in our own state. So this bill for a strategic critical mineral stockpile, I added to the defense bill this year in committee, and there was a vote on it, and the vote was 20-4. Super bipartisan vote to include it. So that's in the NDAA right now. The goal is to get out of the reliance on these strategic critical minerals from China within 10 years. And I'm hopeful that Alaska can provide our nation a lot of those. So I think there's really big opportunities as we have awakened to this vulnerability that we all recognize, not just on stockpiles that weren't full, but on supply lines that made us very vulnerable and very reliant on China. And we're moving to address this.
Thank you, Senators. We're about out of time, but if you'd like to give a few closing remarks before we end, we'll go to Senator Murkowski first.
Hey, thanks, Mike. I'm not going to give closing, but I do want to comment. One of our earlier questioners had mentioned wanting to know when the PPP loan forgiveness application was going to be out. I am told that there is a 5-page PPP loan forgiveness application out, and there is an easy application as well as full form. And so apparently this revised PPP loan forgiveness application came out on the 16th of June, along with a new easy version and instructions. So if there's further questions about that, I know we always offer up the great expertise of our staff. Know that we continue to stand by to help any of you move through not only the PPP programs, but any of these other federal programs that we've put in place. So if we can help you with this further, happy to do so. Just contact either our local offices, and I'm offering for both myself and Senator Sullivan, but we do have great staff that can help send you in the right direction. But apparently on the 16th of June, there was a new revised loan forgiveness application that was put online, as well as the easy form. So I just wanted to say that, and I wanted to thank everyone for your time this evening, and just be well out there.
And thank you, Lisa, and I want to thank everybody again for taking the time to join Senator Murkowski and me on these what we see as very important engagements. I think her last point is one that we're hearing from and we know is an issue, which is these new programs. They're critical in terms of relief for many Alaskans, many Americans, to get through these challenging times. So please use our offices. We have great staff in D.C. and around the state. The main Anchorage office for my office number is 907-271-5915. And if you didn't get to ask a question tonight, please stay on the line and you can record your question with some of our team. I actually try to reach out and call Alaskans in response to their questions, even though we don't always get to you on these Teletown Halls, but do it later in the week or over the weekend. So thanks again for tuning in. Let us know what the issues are. Let us know how we can help you get through what are clearly challenging times from a health perspective and economic and jobs perspective for our state. But we will get through them stronger and more resilient than ever. And it's an honor to be working with everybody to get us through this pandemic and get out on the other side with a brighter future. So thanks again.
All right, thank you, Senators. That's all the time we have this evening. As Senator Sullivan just mentioned, if you wanted to ask a question of the Senators tonight but you weren't able to, please hang on the line afterwards, and you'll be prompted to leave a message, and our offices will work to get you an answer. With that, have a great evening, stay safe, and good night.
Thank you all.